All right, that's fine. Apparently my keyboard needs new batteries. All right, so maybe we can. So let's run through this really quick and start looking at a couple of these things. So these are pretty interesting, at least to me, because now we're starting to get into more of the technical pieces. So we're going to look at things like firewalls. We're going to look at, and I know you guys are going to laugh when I talk about dial-up access, but it's actually used more than you would imagine in secure environments because it gives you an ability. So it's being replaced slowly in most places, but there still is a dial-up security model. And if we go to outside of our country, the reality is there's a lot of places where dial-up access is really all they have. So we're going to look at cryptography real quick. We're going to look at a couple of really interesting things. So identification versus authentication. So how do we validate somebody's identity? And so a couple of things that we're going to look at. A lot of places now are moving to a two-factor authentication. Places are moving to where, so not only do you need a username, do you need a password, but some other phrase or something else. So how do we identify that you really are you? And so there's some new methods coming in. There's a lot of biometric things that are coming out. And it's one thing that we look at. And in fact, so in this latest issue of Computer World that I just got, I'm scanning through it, and here's an article about the FBI and what they're doing. And so obviously the same type of things, they want to know who somebody is also, but for a little different reason. But they're talking about, so there's some interesting things that have come out of here. They're looking at now palm prints also, in addition to just fingerprints. They're looking at iris, they're looking at facial recognition, and all of those things are really things that are also could be used for authentication into our system. Now, it is interesting they talk about fingerprints and how accurate and the efficiency, and there's some details. So it's actually not a bad article to read if you're looking about what the FBI has on you. I mean, what the FBI has on other people. But they're really looking at iris recognition, mug shots. So they've set up experiments at a lot of very large population centers. So things that have a lot of people going through them, Super Bowls, World Series games. They will actually do facial recognition to try to profile people. Now, here's my thought. If you have a warrant, why would you be going to the Super Bowl where you know you're in public? But some people apparently are willing to do those kinds of things. True. Do you know where he's at? Yep. Maybe. But it also talks about like some of the details of IFAS. So the old server ran on 64 blades. The current one they have now has over 1,000 blades just in the server for fingerprint recognition. And so they've reduced the time for fingerprint matches from the 10 cards. So those cards when you go into the station and get fingerprinted for background checks. So under controlled conditions, they're very good fingerprints. They reduced the matching from about 2 hours down to 10 minutes on those. Now, fingerprints they pull out of, crime scenes take a lot longer because they're usually not that good of password. But so one of the things we're moving to is the idea of passphrases. So rather than just a password, people can remember passphrases a little better. The cow jumped over the moon is easier to remember than 3718 exclamation point $, those kinds of passwords. So most systems, including Windows 7, Windows 8, can do a long passphrase up to 250 characters. But then again, you have to balance that against typing that whole series out and making a mistake, having to retype it. So one of the things that our book talks about, and they show you one called an e-wallet. I like one called KeePass. There's a ton of different password managers out there. Now you want to investigate them because you certainly don't want to get a password manager that really is stealing all your information at the same time, but they allow you to manage those. So this is the one called e-wallet, and some of the other ones look very similar. So a couple of other things that people have started looking at are some systems and some computer installations, you use a smart card or a dumb card. So a smart card has a computer chip and does some processing. A dumb card is just a magnetic strip card. And so some places have systems where you swipe a card to log into your system. Some have a very smart card. Some of them will use some kind of a token. So sometimes they even will hang around your neck and they'll generate a little key number whenever you push a button. And so some of those are pretty sophisticated at generating a code and a number. They're fairly pricey. So obviously the more secure, the more memory, the more processing, the more expensive they are. A dumb card is, 50 cents a piece, whereas a smart card is significantly more expensive. So biometrics is something that we look at, and a lot of computers now, so if I go buy a Lenovo business laptop, it'll come with actually two forms of biometrics that you can deploy, both a fingerprint scanner, and they also will do a facial recognition, which works about 80 to 90% of the time. The fingerprints tend to be really good. The new fingerprint readers are fairly hard to beat. So hand geometry, facial recognition, iris scans, retina scans. Retina scans are one of the better ones. They are the best. But they're one of the things that's very hard to change. So fingerprints can not really change, but we can scar over our fingers and make them hard to read. So as we get faster and faster machines, some of these are going to be utilized. So biometrics, what kind of rate of false and false acceptance? So how many times do we reject somebody? How many times do we falsely accept somebody? So we really have to look at those technologies. And the fingerprint scanners are getting to the point where they're pretty good. So in a lot of businesses, so if I go into a hospital, and I don't know if Auburn that I know John works at, but a lot of places use something called a Pyxis for medical drugs, and they use a fingerprint scanner. And the latest versions of that are pretty decent. The first generation that were out about 5 or 6 years ago were pretty bad. They either wouldn't read your fingerprint or would read everybody's fingerprint the same, and now they've gotten those much, much better. They do things like, I know you've seen in the movies where, the bad guy chops off the hand of somebody. Well, now they have heartbeat detection and some other mechanisms, so that's really not as easy to do. Just in case you were thinking about chopping somebody's hand off to get past their security system. So one of the things we look at a lot of times are this idea of a system log. So once we have access to that system log, these logs can give us a lot of information about what's going on. We use them as a tool even on your desktop PC. So on almost every Windows PC there are event logs, and we can actually look at those to determine what's going on with our computer system. We may look at system logs on firewalls, on routers, and other things to determine who's come in, who's come out. So we always try to save log files, and usually we'll have a policy about how long we want to save log files. So we'll generally have a policy of 30-day log retention on firewalls, something like that. And then the art is sometimes interpreting those. So one of the weird issues we have is making sure that all of our devices have the same time. Because if I have an issue and it occurred at 2 p.m. in the afternoon, but yet my firewall is set at noon because we don't have the clocks consistent, and that's actually been a real issue at a lot of places. So most devices now have some way to pull time from an NTTP server, and so that they're all on the same time, and we actually use that as a security measure. So some kind of log analysis. And so generally, one of the things we'll do in a larger company, and it's a little harder to do at a small company where you generally have one IT person who's there part-time or something, is even that idea of log analysis. So weekly there's 2 hours allotted to somebody to scan through the logs and try to parse through them, clear out the old logs, and see if there were any events that happened. Sometimes we'll use some automated parsing tools, so we'll try to detect if something happened, and that way we can respond a little quicker. If we're an internet service provider, we may have to maintain logs. So one of the interesting things I had happen this semester was I had a student come to me and bring me a letter from their internet service provider / and a law firm saying, here, you need to go to this website and fess up that you downloaded, and in this particular case it was some porn files, and so the owner of these files has contacted all the people that have downloaded them, their internet service providers, because they were downloading through BitTorrent clients, and they're able to trace it back to an internet service provider. An internet service provider that can track it down to an individual user, and they got a letter. So again, that use of those logs, so internet service providers have to maintain those logs. So it's kind of scary to see what sometimes your internet service provider might know about you. So access controls, that idea of maintaining a constant change so we know who's got access, who doesn't. We may have a quarterly review to make sure that those rights are consistent for everybody. We know that we need to revoke rights, so especially in the case of somebody getting fired. But what if they change jobs and we don't revoke the old rights and they still have rights in an older system or an old piece of a system? So we have to have those access controls reviewed on a fairly regular basis. And so usually we create a security matrix that lists who's got what. We use the term firewall, and you probably have seen it in a lot of contemporary TV shows. So if you watch NCIS or something, they're always talking about, ooh, somebody's attacking our firewall or something like that. Well, what is a firewall? And really a firewall is just something in place between the outside world, in other words, what we don't trust, and our inside world, which hopefully we do trust. And so sometimes that firewall exists separately, sometimes it exists inside of another device like a router or other device. And so we're going to look at a couple of different types and what they do. So the kind of the first thing, packet firewalls. So if I have a Linksys router I bought, I can actually turn on a firewall on there that filters by packets. And so I can create rules based on IP addresses, types of packets, ports, what else is in that packet. So I can actually look at them a little bit. Now, the more money I spend, and this is true of a lot of security, the more money I spend, the more features and value I'm going to get. So if I buy the $50 device at Best Buy and it turns on a little bit of filtering, it's not got updates that turn in every hour for different attacks and different things, and it doesn't allow us to customize it to our own needs, but it at least is a start. We may have a firewall our own individual computer. You may see the term Windows firewall, and it does kind of the same thing. It looks for suspicious behavior. So we started moving then to application layer firewalls. So these were often a separate device or a separate computer. We came up with a term called a DMZ zone. So in between our trusted network and our untrusted network, we could put a computer in the DMZ. In other words, it could get to anything on the outside network, and we could filter things through it and allow content back on the inside. And that really led to this idea of something called a proxy server. And that full proxy server then takes everything that we try to access and retrieves it for us and will protect our inside network. And I'll show you what I mean here with a little graphic because I think it makes more sense that way here in just a second. So we have what we call stateful inspections. So they keep track of every connection using a table. So how big that table is a function of the filtering size. And then we have what we call dynamic packet filters. There's some others. We call them one-way diodes and some other things. But what we're really looking at is we put in some kind of a barrier between the outside world and us. So if I look at a firewall, and so the most basic type as we start looking here, so a screened host. So that host, if I notice and I look at my diagram here, well, notice I see I have a bastion host, and that bastion host receives all my requests. And so I'm filtering as much of that content as I can through this bastion host, or we call it a proxy. So it does a couple of things. It protects our internal network because we scan everything through there. We can do updates on that. It also does something kind of interesting in terms of network speed, because what we find in a fairly large network, so even at our college, how many people are accessing ESPN at nearly the same time, for example. And so we can take one copy of ESPN and only update those content pieces that have changed, and we can get a little better network throughput. So that's one model we can look at. So we have a couple of other items we want to talk about in that whole idea. Something called a dual homed. And really a dual homed really only means that it's got two connections. So this really does split us into putting it in the outside versus the inside. And so most of your devices you have at home, you could consider a dual home device. You plug in one network cable on the LAN side and one cable on the WAN side, and it creates a block between the two of them. And so every piece of traffic is forced to go through that firewall. Well, what we also have to do then is something called NAT, natural address translation then. Because we only usually get one outside IP address, and most of us have multiple devices inside of our network. So here at our college campus, we may have 1,000 or more network devices and one outside IP address. And so NAT is that idea of converting from outside to inside addresses. And so that gives us some security in that we don't have directly addressable pieces. We also can use what's called port address. So port numbers, if you've taken the networking class, you remember that port numbers are a combination of an IP address and a port, so it becomes a socket. And so all our web traffic is addressed for the most part on port 80. So it's another way to identify that traffic. So things like secure sockets communications on port 443, all of those have a piece. And so what they look like then is we create something that looks like this. And so we literally have a physical device in between all the inbound and all the outbound. So this dual home device, so we have our external router in a lot of cases, a firewall, and then an internal router. Now, we can shove those all together into one device in a lot of cases, but it gives us a connection so we have, on purpose, kind of a bottleneck or one place that we've managed to route all of our traffic through. So dual homed has some advantages. It does force all that traffic through. It has some disadvantages. One, you have one device that if it fails, your entire network can drop offline. So if I'm at my house and my firewall / router / everything fails, we're done. It can also have some traffic issues. So again, you're going to spend a lot of money to get one fast enough for a very large network. In some cases, we may have redundant copies of these, so we may have multiples in parallel, and that way we can have some failover. And in a lot of cases, though, this is kind of the minimal approach method to doing that. So then we have screened subnet firewalls. In other words, what we're doing is creating something very similar, with the exception of we put some of our servers in this, what we call that DMZ zone. They can access the outside world and the inside world, but they're both being controlled and evaluated when they do that. And so that's a very common method we do for places that have to have machines that are both on the inside and on the outside of the network. So we don't expose any of our servers directly to the internet, but we also give them a place where they can contact the outside. So one of the things when we start looking about firewalls is most of us aren't firewall experts. So what type of technology, what kind of costs? So a lot of times what we'll do is bring in a security consultant. They'll evaluate our needs and then make some recommendations, and then we'll do an RFP to vendors. So we may then contact 4 or 5 vendors and say, this is what I think we need. What kind of pricing are we talking about? What kind of things are we? And it's very easy to get into, even for a small business, into a a firewall that can cost $1,000 a year in maintenance. Because a really good firewall, so if I have a Cisco or I have a Watchdog or something else, they're getting updates, and they do updates to these files that they look at and where the threats are. In most cases on an hourly or a 10-minute or some kind of interval. And so you're paying for that subscription, plus you're paying for the device. So you also want to look at how easy are they to configure? What kind of things can we change? Do I have to go through the security vendor? And some of the times you'll find that you have to go through a security vendor. So can it grow with our network? Are they expandable? Those kinds of questions we all want to look at, because if our company is going to grow, we're going to have to obviously expand and grow with that. So generally a firewall is a list of rules, and so those rule sets can be pretty complex. And in fact, you can drop your entire network connection pretty easily by creating rules that conflict with each other. And so that's kind of interesting. So it's another tool we use. Usually we'll hire somebody to set up those initial rules, and then we'll kind of tweak them and fine-tune them in our own IT department as to what kind of traffic we actually have. And you'll find that your traffic starts changing a little bit by the fact that you even have these in there. And if we get to the point where we're putting in spam firewall for our email servers, you'll start to see that transition also a little bit. So one of the things we look at on those rules is sometimes we look at which rule gets implemented first, because we can weed out a lot of traffic based on how we run those rules. So if we have a rule that'll weed out 50% of the traffic and a rule that reads out 1%, if we scan those in the 50% rule first and then the 1% rule, it can actually work far more efficiently. So one of the problems with firewalls is they're not very smart. We give them all these rules, but if something doesn't fit the rule pattern, they don't know what to do. So we have to be able to figure out what we're looking for. They're also prone to flaws, programming errors, what we screw up. They can only happen at the hardware capacity. In other words, so if we've upgraded our capacity on our network to 100 gig per second on an external connection, and we have a router that can only handle 1 gig, we have a blockage there. So we need to realize what those limitations are and what kind of limitations we have there. And so you may think, well, I'm just getting internet today. How is this going to be a limitation? Well, sometimes that internet speed or our connection may increase, so we may do something strange that causes that. So we may need to do some planning ahead. Do they offer a trade-in program or a trade-up program? And a lot of these vendors do, because they certainly want to keep you as a customer. But the reality is they're only as good as the people that are programming it, and our guesses about what kind of behavior is going to happen. So if I have a firewall and I'm managing it, I tend to have some kind of training. I need to have somebody that's responsible for it. So generally they don't just get implemented and then we walk away from it. There has to be some responsibility, and that may be part of a service contract. So I may contract Watchdog to remotely manage my server and my firewall remotely for me. So there's some practices that are pretty common that we want to look at. So all of our traffic from our trusted network is allowed out, generally. So that can make our life easier because we allow all the traffic to flow out and we only have to look at traffic on the way in. And we're going to talk about something a little different than that here in a minute. The firewall device is never accessible from externally. How do we manage that? And so we also look at SMTP traffic. Where does it route to? We want to deny all ICMP traffic, so all control traffic we're going to try to deny. And so what we're trying to also do then is keep anything that's got web traffic. So if we're going to have our own web server, we want to keep that traffic sitting in that DMZ zone so we can screen it. And so one of the worst security issues that I've ever seen was actually foisted on us by Microsoft in this idea of a small business server. So all of these things I've talked about, putting things in the DMZ, having your web content available only from something in the DMZ, but your internal servers being isolated, Microsoft came out with this product called Small Business Server that combines a web server, your active domain, your email, all these functions that need to be separated rolled into one box. It is not a good thing, but it was cheap. So they sold a lot of it to businesses who then you'd come in and here's a security issue because you're allowing people to get access to the same box directly that controls all your internal controls. So it's one of those pet peeves against Microsoft that I have, and I like a lot of their products. So once we move past the firewall then, so we've got our firewall in place, then we look at something like an intrusion detection system. And so an intrusion detection system then, not only is it based on rules, but it's based on a little different set of rules. And it's based on the idea that we're going to look and see if somebody is trying to get into our system. Well, are they getting into our system? And so these usually are a little quicker. So they'll email us a response. And in fact, the really interesting part about that, the most common intrusion detection system out there, the software itself is free. It's called Snort. Running it, though, is not easy at all, and it is not an easy-to-use system. So if you can manage and understand Snort and be able to use it, you can probably find a pretty good job being a Snort manager. But the intrusion detection systems look at, are we being attacked and what are we happening? So one of the things that they have the ability to do then is remotely drop all connections. So they can change content. So our firewall will drop and stop things. The intrusion detection system not only does that, but it can look at that content and make decisions. And we can make decisions based on those things. So the reality is I can't stop all port 80 traffic into my web server, even though that's where all the attacks are, because that's also how we get content in and out of it. So these intrusion detection systems are yet another layer and another piece that we can implement. So you'll see they make a differentiation between host and network based, and for most of our cases they work really, really the same. But we may even go beyond a intrusion detection system on a lot of systems. We may actually put in a system that looks then at, and notice I said on most of these we look at only on the traffic going in and not the traffic going out. Well, in a lot of instances, we now want to add the ability to look at traffic going back out of our system. And for a couple of reasons. One, what if we do have a computer that got infected and is sending out spam emails? So we want to be able to track that. And then we want to look at what happens if we have people that are sending out information. So we may look at some way to contain information within our company and stop it. So if suddenly I saw that traffic was leaving Peru State College and it contained a lot of social security numbers or other identifiable information, I could very quickly stop that traffic on the outbound side also. And so that's where we're kind of headed to. So you'll have a firewall, you'll have an intrusion detection system, and you may have a content management system that looks at what kind of content is being disseminated both up and down. So you'll see that our book talks about the idea there's a difference between behavior-based, which was really just kind of a statistics-based intrusion detection system. So it would look over time and say, hey, this is what we normally have happening, this is outside of that range. So now we have ones that are called anomaly-based. So anomaly-based then looks at our normal traffic and says, hey, this is different, and it can respond a little quicker. So all of those, though, have to have some existing baselines of traffic to be able to use that. So the other things that intrusion detection systems do is in a lot of cases they install agents, and so they may put agents on every device that connects to the outside world so that they can monitor the traffic and see what's going on. So we know we need people to get access to us, and so remotely, how do we secure that? So I know we've talked a little bit about dial-up access, and that seems horrible to even think about, but there are a lot of things that are dial-up still. So if I'm a company that has a lot of credit card transactions, in most cases those credit card machines are dial-up, aren't they? They take over a phone line and dial up Well, my server that's connecting to that, I want to protect it. So there's a couple of things. So a war dialer. So a war dialer is an older technology. It really just sits there and I put in a range of phone numbers. So if I know that all the numbers in town are 402-872-XXXX, I set up a war dialer to dial every number from 0000 to 9999. And so if I can find some numbers that respond, that becomes a way that I can gain access. So we also see the same thing used on fax machines. There are war dialers for fax machines trying to find fax numbers. So if you have a fax machine sitting on a phone line, you'll see every once in a while you get these spam faxes. And that's one of the things they do is a very similar thing. They war dial against your fax machine trying to obtain it. I know of nobody who has picked up a hot stock sheet as a spam fax and actually bought a stock off of it, but yet somebody must or they would quit doing that. So there are a couple of things that have popped out that give us some increased control. And one of them, and you'll see this term when we talk about wireless also, is something called radius. And you'll see the same term used as radius, but it's a remote authentication protocol. And so it's a way we can authenticate who you are when you do call in. So there's a lot of systems, unfortunately, that aren't very secure, that use login systems with remote access. One of those is a lot of phone systems. So very large PBX phone systems have one line dedicated in a lot of cases to remote access via a phone line. And those tend to be kind of insecure. So it's another thing we need to look at in terms of how do we secure our entire system. One of the worst things about those large phone systems is they're installed by contractors, and those contractors don't want to have to remember 30 different installations and 30 different passwords. So you know what they tend to do? They leave the default password in place, or so if it's a Novell phone system or Novartis, some brand, they'll leave whatever's default, or they'll use the same for all of theirs anyway. And so if we go back into the Target issue, it was an HVAC controller that was one of the ways they gained access, and my guess is that, like a lot of these things, the HVAC controller didn't want to mess with 150 different clients and 150 different usernames and logins, so they used one username and login. So the lesson is it's a little more maintenance in an issue, but we need to have some way to be able to control those and make sure that they're all unique. So we also have something called Taxis. So Taxis is generally used on Unix systems. So if we need to dial in remotely into a Unix system, you'll see the term Taxis. So we talk about it and you're thinking, well, I'm not going to have those, but you don't know when you get into a situation. So I go to work for State Farm, how many different remote connections do they actually have? So State Farm may have a ton of these available because they may end up in places where they have to set up remote operations, and that's the only way they can get data back to their central servers. Now, if I'm the local State Farm Bureau agency, this may not be as big a concern, but we want to determine, so a lot of places have forgotten how many different phone lines they have, what they have for remote access. So one of the things you might want to do in your security audits is look at how many dial-up connections do we have? How are we controlling them? What about the idea of using a callback? What about token authentications if we can use it? So all those kinds of things we want to look at, and it's part of that overall seeing what's available in our picture. So certainly Target probably wasn't thinking that the HVAC controller was going to be a way in to their system, but it certainly became one. So wireless protection, there's a couple of things we want to look at there. So how big is our footprint? In other words, how much area? So here at our college campus, you can get to our wireless networks off of our campus. So how big a footprint do we emit? What areas do we have signal? There's a term war driving, which is kind of what we did at the library. If we're in a bigger city, it's kind of interesting to go through an area and see how many access points open that haven't been encrypted you can find. So if you live in a dorms or you live in an apartment, it's kind of frightening sometimes what you can do. And remember, WPA, WPA2, if you can do it, never use WEP. So there's a couple of those. WEP WEP is evil. Make it go away. It should never happen again. WPA, the problem is there's a lot of stuff that's still out on WEP. So WPA, there's a couple of different models of WPA. There's a pre-shared key. So there is something called WiMAX, which we're not going to see around this area, but if you see in a larger town, you might be able to see that. And so it's really a fourth generation wireless technology that in a lot of cases can run 10 to 15 miles. And so the nearest one I know of is Lawrence, Kansas. There's a WiMAX system set up there. So for 30 or 50 bucks a month, your laptop can connect anywhere in that 15-mile radius. Bluetooth, almost everything has Bluetooth. Well, Bluetooth is interesting. It's got a limited range of about 30 feet or so, I thought. So wireless headphones use it. You can use it as a modem connection. Here's one of the issues. Bluetooth, when you have paired up anything, does it ask for a password in a lot of cases to pair up? Well, it either skips it or uses a password of 0000 or 1234. So it's Bluetooth is on, and we can actually construct a device to be able to grab Bluetooth using an antenna, and we can grab it at a far longer distance. And in fact, sometimes it could be kind of interesting. So I followed my girlfriend back to Lincoln the other day, and because we'd taken a trip in my vehicle, we paired her cell phone with my Bluetooth. And I was at least 150 feet behind her, driving 85 miles an hour, and all of a sudden I looked down, and my entertainment system said I was making a phone call. And it was very interesting, because if I was grabbing her Bluetooth signal off of her iPhone from at least 150 feet away, and able to intercept her phone call. Now, she wasn't able to, and it took a little bit to figure out what was going on, so then she turned off Bluetooth on her phone, but she has Bluetooth in her car, but for whatever reason, it was registering with mine at 100 feet away at least. So, Bluetooth has some issues. Turn it off if you don't need it. If you're not actively using it, turn it off. There are people working very hard on breaking Bluetooth and being able to come into those. So we've looked at some of these tools when we looked at Kali Linux. We looked at things like a port scanner and a vulnerability scanner. So those kinds of things that we're looking for active ports and services. And so we'll go back and look at it next week a little more on those. A couple of tools we're going to show you in class on how to look at those. Vulnerability scanners. So vulnerability scanners take that idea of opening those ports and then try to identify some information on them a little bit. A packet sniffer. So if I have a packet sniffer, and there's ones for wireless and for wired, so packet sniffers just try to grab those data packets. So if I'm using an older network that's got hubs, they're very, very easy to utilize because all of that content is actually shared. If I'm using wireless, sometimes I can grab those wireless signals if they're unencrypted. Even if they're encrypted, I can get the packets. I just don't know what they are unless I had that unencryption key. So we use them, and so we use them in our 310 class, for example. We teach you a tool called Wireshark, or look at it. Well, Wireshark can grab packets. There's a ton of different ways we can grab these packets. Gives you an analysis. It also can scare you the amount of information because everything you send on your computer is being sent there. If I have a switch network, that switch in theory connects a one-to-one, one computer to one device. So we have to do a little more work to figure out a way to get that extraneous packets off of there. And so in a lot of cases, what we'll do is actually force a switch to break. And when a switch breaks, it becomes a hub, and all of that information is on one wire, essentially. So you may have some kind of something called a content filter. And so pretty commonly at a business, we'll put a content filter in place similar to a firewall. So we may do it as software. So in this classroom, we use a tool called LAN School, and we can block some connections and some things. If we blocked it in the same way we put a firewall, so we put a spam filter right in between there or a web filter, we could block it at that network level and it never gets to that computer or that traffic level. We can also use it to analyze what kind of content people are on. So it's sometimes interesting and scary. You might want to use that as a time analysis tool to see what kind of people are doing on your network, why they are there. Why does somebody always end up with 37 toolbars? Well, that's because they're doing that. So we have something called a honeypot, or our book calls it a trap and trace. So we may put what we think looks like very rich content either externally or internally. And so we can try to trap and entice users or hackers or people in there. So one of the things internally with a company we may do is give you a shared network drive and have a folder that says, salaries of administration personnel and tell you never to go there. That would be a honeypot. You would be clicking in there trying to get it, and we would track who did that to see who's compliant with our rules and regulations. Well, we do it externally the same way. We may put up a fake server and try to trap people. So in other words, we're enticing them away from the real services and the real server and sending them to a honeypot. So, and again, all of these tools, we can use them all, but we have to know what we're doing with them. So we also have to know what they're being used for. And the reality is our network is generally dynamic. So we have to make sure that we're scanning it at various times. So if I come in at midnight and I'm doing a vulnerability scanning on my network and that's the only time I do that, that's kind of a useless piece because that may be different. So a couple of other things we have internal to our company. If I own the company and it's my computer and I own it and I've hired you, I can set exactly explicitly what you can use. If I'm a public institution, I have a lot of rules about what I can and can't do. So libraries can't ban, for example, pornography because that's considered free speech. And in fact, that nebulous area of what's pornography becomes an issue. So think about if I'm working at a medical clinic. So ads that we would normally ban in our email, for example, like Viagra, we may have to allow because that could be certainly a legitimate medical reason. So all of those we have to be a little careful about what rules we fall under. So if we're a government agency, if we're a public agency, if we're a private company, what can we do? We may have to articulate in our user's manual to employees or handbook that your email is public record or your email is property of the company. We can retrieve it at any time and are willing to do that. So all of those things we have to articulate in a couple different places. We have to make sure that we're on legal good grounds when we do this. So the last piece we'll quickly go over here today is the idea of cryptography. So cryptography is that way of we encode, and we've sent you a little bit of a link before with an XOR, and we made you do a little bit of analysis and look at it. The reality is cryptography is that way we encode our messages. So just like we did when we were in grade school, and you'd transcribe the alphabet a little different with numbers or letters and create your own little code, that's really what you're doing. So you're ciphering the original message into some kind of an encrypted message, and then you have the ability to then decrypt it. And so there's a lot of different standards for this, and we had an entire little piece about it. But so some that are really common that we've used. So substitution ciphers, so where you substitute in a number for a letter, those kinds of things. So what we generally do the most common thing we do is something called an XOR. So in other words, we have our data stream and it's in binary, and we transpose it a little bit using that binary, and we move it around a little bit. So we can rotate it. So there's a ton of different ones out there. This could be an entire college degree literally working with cryptanalysis. And in some places it is. So what I want to point out is there's something called symmetric and asymmetric keys. So different methods. So if I can somehow get a private key in use between both of us, so that both of us have the same key, I can do a private key message or a symmetric encryption. So it's encrypted and decrypted exactly the same way. The problem is, how do I pass that secret key back and forth? So a lot of times what we have to resort to, and what we see most commonly, is something called asymmetric. So there's two different keys. And so in other words, there's a private key and a public key. So two different keys are being used, and we see this all the time. So a lot of companies will actually publish their public key, and then they have an internal private key. And only through that combination of both of those are we able to encrypt and decrypt messages. So if I set up an email system that uses encrypted email, generally, so if I'm using Zix or something, they publish a public key, and then we have our private keys. And so on each side, we can decrypt this message. So encryption is a fun and exciting and wonderful system. We have a couple of issues with it right now, though. So there's some fairly common ones. You're going to see X or RSA. There's public key. Well, there are a couple of them we can use on our email, for example. One of them that's interesting is something called PGP, and that's an open source effort. Any of these encryption methods, if we lose those keys, are for the most part secure for at least the next 200 years. So even the largest server farm we have now can't unencrypt at the level of encryption that we're doing now. So that's good. It also has some implications though as a business. What if we get our email encrypted but we don't know how to do that, or we don't know how to unencrypt it, or we lose the key? Or what if we get hit by the CryptoLocker virus, which is what it does is encrypts all our files? How do we deal with it? So a couple of other things dealing with crypto we're going to look at. So you're going to see the term SSL for secure socket layers. So if I go to a website and it's HTTPS instead of HTTP, that's a secure socket. And so that's kind of the issue, that secure socket behind the Heartbleed. So you'll also see SHTTP, secure hypertext, secure shell if we're going into a remote connection. So there is even a secure method of FTP traffic. So if you took the web design class, we used FTP, it was unsecure. It's unencrypted, it's in plain text, but there are methods to encrypt that. Thank you, Java, for, no, I don't want to update Java, thank you. So be sure you read about IPsec, Kerberos. You'll see that more often in your servers. So there's a ton of information in our book. This week we looked at biometrics, we looked at firewalls. Next week we're actually going to, on the live computer lab, we're actually going to set up a couple of computers and allow people to try to get them as infected as possible. And so we're going to look at a couple of tools that we'll use to remove those. So that hopefully will be a little more fun next week. All right, so have a great Easter or 420 day or whatever you want to celebrate on Easter. And